You know, this is not really a scheduled meeting. But the last time we had a talk to the people, which Secretary Bello of the Department of Labor was invited. And in nutshell, he was complaining about the length of time that the OFW and returning travelers or travelers and OFWs are being detained, to use the word, too long. That's what he said. And it has depleted the budget that was been allotted by government sa kanila, sa Department of Labor. So, there was a bit of a discussion, but I thought it wise to just maybe cut it, and since this is a question of science and medical issue, it would be useless for us to be debating here and talking about these things. We will just invite the experts, and so that they can shed light, provide enlightenment to us and to the public why this is so. Now, the thing here is, I'd like to ask Secretary Bello, do you want, or are you ready to repeat your, they are here. I would rather that sabihin mo na lang yung sinabi mo noon, kasi wala sila dito, so that they can respond correctly and accurately to your, well, it might be your misgivings or it might be your doubts. Hindi nila narinig eh. But so kailangan you might just repeat it. Anyway, it's for public good. Wala namang problema diyan kung sino ang mali, kung sino ang hindi. There's nobody here who is really correct and nobody here who is totally wrong insofar as public good is concerned. So I would rather that you repeat what you have complained, it was really complained, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and with due respect to our medical experts, especially the technical working group of the interagency task force, I came up with the report, Mr. President, about the heavy burden that the new protocol has on our resources. Ang sinasabi ko nga, Mr. President, from the record of the IATF and TFTGROF, one-stop shop, yung COVID-19 testing positivity rate of returning overseas Filipinos for 2020 is only 2.07%. Ngayon, under 2021, Mr. President, the current quarantine protocol of 7 to 9 days stay of OFWs in hotel quarantine facilities, the COVID-19 testing positivity rate is only 1.5%. Kaya nga po kami nakikiusap sana, Mr. President, na kung mari, we go back to the original protocol noon, na pagdating nung ating mga OFWs, swab agad sila. Then, they are quarantined for 5 days while waiting for the result of the PCR test. Eh kapag negative sila, then they can be transported to their final destination. Kasi, Mr. President, aside from the economic consideration, these OFWs have long missed their homes. Ang tagal nila abroad kumikita, naghihirap para lamang kumita para sa pamilya nila. Ngayon, inuwi natin sila. And they have to stay for almost 14 days in quarantine. Notwithstanding the fact na after 5 days, they have been found to be negative. Bakit hindi natin sila pauwiin, Mr. President? And going back to my figures na 2.7% lang naman ang nagpapakita na yung ating mga overseas Filipinos nagpo-pass positive sila. Kaya yun po ang pakiusap namin. Of course, I will still yield to the decision of the IATF, Mr. President. Kaya lang gusto ko pong iparating yung kalagayan ng ating mga OFW. Talagang hirap na hirap sila, Mr. President. They are crying. Itong cellphone ko, Mr. President, no less than 300 to 500 text messages I receive from them every day. Kailan kami uwi? Ang tagal naman ng resulta ng PCR. Ganun, Mr. President. And we cannot close our eyes to the miseries of our OFWs. Kaya yun, pakiusap lang naman, Mr. President. Kung pwede naman, pwede lang. Kung hindi naman, then we still submit to the decision of the IATF, Mr. President.
Okay. Is that all? Yun na yun, Bot? Yun naman talaga ang sinabi mo noon. It's just the same. So, I'd like to call before our government members of the panel, I'd like to call Dr. Edsel Maurice Serpania. Sir, can you enlighten us on this?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon to all the members of the IATF and the resource persons. I completely understand and commiserate with Secretary Bello that this is really something that is a difficult situation, especially quarantine. Ako po last year, na-quarantine rin po ako, and it was really the longest few days of my life na separated from the family. So I understand the personal impact of this po. However, we know po that COVID, especially the variants of concern, have come into the country through the different through returning travelers po. And this is why it is really essential that we have some sort of control to prevent the entry of these variants of concern. Do I have my slides? Can I ask the Secretariat to share my slides? While we are waiting, Mr. President, I think that everybody naman is cognizant of the fact that the quarantine has already, it really has an impact. But what our proposed solution po is actually there is data that we can shorten quarantine from 14 days to 10 days, provided that the person remains asymptomatic during that whole time. The second point that we will make po once I have my slides is also that the testing kasi, ang timing po ng testing is really the problem. If somebody gets infected in transit on the plane, pag tinest niyo po siya pagdating, hindi pa po magpa-positive yan. It usually takes 3 to 5 days for the person to turn positive on PCR. And so that's why po yung ginawa natin is we test on the 5th day. But based on the Department of Health data, in fact, even after the 5th day, there are still about 40% of people who still test positive on the 7th day po of arrival. So our proposed solution po kasi is that the testing, even on the 5th day, will still not pick up everyone. So it is either we test on the 7th day or we completely do away with the testing, but make sure that we quarantine everybody until the 10th day po. And this can be done in facility, but again, it is very expensive, or we can do this at home as long as the LGUs can supervise strict every day. Parang po yung sa Singapore na alam po nila kung lumalabas yung tao o hindi, para sigurado po na hindi sila hindi sila makaspread ng COVID, because that is really our biggest concern, is that if somebody comes in with a variant of concern and transmits it to the community, which has already happened in Pasay, magkakalat po talaga and magsa-search po tayo ulit. Test on arrival po, tapos if negative, complete 14 days isolation at home or at the LGU. And then, noong December 2020 po, when we met with you po sa Malacanang because of the variants, ang ginawa po natin, 14 days facility-based quarantine. And we tested on the 5th day. And then, earlier this year, in February, we shifted to the 5-day facility quarantine with testing on the 6th day. And kung negative, rini-release po. With the stipulation that the LGU continue to make sure that they quarantine to complete 14 days po. Next slide, please. So, ito po yung advantage nung dati, before December, mabilis po siya kasi testing on arrival, and of course, it's less costly. The disadvantage is that because kung nahawa ka ng virus in the plane, hindi pa magpa-positive yung test mo, and if we release you, then ikakalat mo po yung virus in your LGU if they are not very good at ensuring na naka-quarantine po kayo ng 14 days. So, nasa handoff po ito from the airport to the LGU na nagkakaroon ng problema. Next slide, please. And then yung from December 2020 to February 2021, ito po actually was ideal because we really kept people in facility for 14 days. And halos nakita nyo naman po, wala tayo naging holiday surge. We were able to control the variants up to February. So your, yung inutos nyo po ito na 2 weeks na facility-based quarantine, this was the most efficient way of controlling the entry. The problem is po, it's very expensive and was not sustainable, and that is why we changed it in February. Next slide, please. And when we changed it in February, the stipulation was 5 days, and then test, and then the LGU should strictly monitor the completion of quarantine. And the advantage of this was less expensive, and the testing on the 5th day is better than testing on arrival. Kasi again, if you test on arrival, baka nagtatago pa yung virus, hindi pa po siya magpa-positive. So the disadvantage, as Sec. Bello has already said, this is still very expensive. And now that we have seen na even up to the 7th day, pwede pa sila mag-test positive sa 7th day rather than the 5th day. So may namimiss pa rin po. And of course, we did have some lapses, kaya po kasama rin po dun sa ating search ngayon, nakita po natin kumalat ng konti yung variants of concern. Next slide, please. And so, yung just some definitions po, when we talk about true and false positives, yung pag nag-positive po sa PCR, almost always tunay po yan. The only question is whether nakakahawa siya or naka-recover na siya. And then, we can distinguish this naman as long as we look at the history of the traveler. Kung nagkaroon na siya ng symptoms, most likely, nawawala na yon. Pero kung nagsisimula pa lang yung symptoms niya, that is a real positive. We can distinguish that po. So, true false positive is very rare. So, hindi po namin iniisip yun masyado. If somebody tests positive, the safest action po talaga is to isolate, especially kung may variants of concern tayo. Kasi nakita nyo naman kahit yung nangyari sa Benguet, isa lang yung makalusot, catastrophic po talaga. Next slide, please. This really just shows po yung rate of RT-PCR result. If you notice, wala pong 100% dyan. And that is why we say that testing is optional. Kasi even if you test someone who is symptomatic, there's still a possibility na magne-negative pa rin yung test. And so this is why it is, we say that testing is optional for as long as we can complete the 10 days quarantine. Kasi yun po yung mas sigurado to say na hindi nakakahawang isang tao rather than testing on the 1st day, on the 5th day, or on the 7th day. Next slide, please. This just shows the period na nagpa-positive po yung virus at kung kailan po siya nakakahawa. Next slide, please. So ito po yung proposed changes as we have already mentioned. We can shorten the duration of quarantine from 14 days if there are no symptoms to the end of 10 days. Basta walang symptoms, we can do it 10 days. Testing is optional unless somebody is symptomatic. If we are going to test someone who does not have symptoms, it should be done on the 7th day. Ideally pa rin, facility-based quarantine, but we recognize that this is very expensive. if for LGU home quarantine, as long as it can be assured, dapat daily po and strict compliance at home, and dapat set up po talaga yung house. And then any positive test will be reviewed, but the safest to assume it is still contagious and you need to complete isolation. Next slide, please. So there are two options that we are talking about. One is strict facility quarantine and selective testing. So we want everyone to get isolated for 10 days, but you can optional po yung 7th day testing. Kahit walang testing, pag nakumpleto yung 10 days and walang symptoms, we can release them po. Next slide, please. And then option 2, if tapos po talaga yung funds for facility-based quarantine, we can do strict LGU quarantine. If they are set up at home, we can do that. If not, sa TTMF kung pwede. And selective testing as mentioned on the 7th day po. Next slide. That's it po. Thank you very much.
Ang sunod si, have I called Dr. Ana Ong Lim?
Good evening po, Mr. President. The technical advisory group had some preliminary discussions po regarding the current issue, and we were thinking that based on the data that we have right now, it's a better option to review the testing protocol, make sure that it can be done at a later, rather recommend that it be done at a later time, but that the critical intervention should really be that quarantine should be strictly enforced, because whether or not testing is done, as long as quarantine can be imposed, then we continue to keep our borders safe. So yun pong nuances nun, when the test is best done, will actually be moot kung ma-i-impose po natin ng maayos yung quarantine from end to end. Sir, I mentioned po that the recommendation that the TAG worked on as it met prior to this briefing was actually to propose that it's more critical to focus on quarantine measures because this will ensure that any entry of variants from travelers can be better controlled. This is really coming from the fact that tests always have a false negative rate, and if we really want to secure our borders, then the only way to go is to implement quarantine strictly, well, preferably for 14 days, but at the minimum, at least for 10 days po. And then yung testing can actually be something that we will forgo kung mai-implement po natin yung 10 araw, at kung ano man po yung mga savings na ma-generate dahil hindi na po tayo magte-test, pwede naman po sigurong maipasok naman dun po sa ating quarantine program if you feel that that's something that will help po.
I would call next is to Dr. Marisa Alejandria, the member of the TAG for COVID-19.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Secretary Bello. Yes, I appreciate and understand the physical, mental, and emotional burden, plus the financial burden, economic burden brought about by our quarantine policy. However, we recognize also that quarantine is really one way to prevent the spread of the virus, and considering that this virus has a pre-symptomatic, yung may tinatawag tayong phase na kahit wala pang symptom, pwede na siyang makahawa. Kaya that is the basis po for the 14 days. Yung incubation period is 5 to 14 days. So median of 5 to 7 days. Ang pinaka-infectious period is yung first week, 5 to 7 days. And that was the basis of testing at the 5th day. But as mentioned by Dr. Salvania, and we looked for new data, no? So there is data from CDC, and they did modeling studies also that we can reduce the quarantine period to 10 days, no, from 14 days without testing, and the residual, no, transmission risk is just about 1%, no, can go down to 0.1 to 10%. So yun yung parang compromise, or it's a good compromise in the sense that we reduce the duration of the period of quarantine with minimal effect on the number of infections that we may miss out. So just for, as long as they remain asymptomatic without symptoms, and they will complete the quarantine period, no, in the LGU, at home, or at the quarantine facilities with strict implementation and monitoring po. So the TAG experts, now we concur that we can relax the 14 days to 10 days without testing as long as they remain asymptomatic and monitoring is strictly implemented. At any period that the traveler or the overseas Filipino worker gets symptoms during that 10-day, then testing should be done. So the system should be in place, now to be able to isolate once they get symptoms and they get tested. And then that's the policy that we can adapt if we are to considering that taking into consideration the economic burden, the physical, emotional burden that the 14-day quarantine is imposing. Thank you po.
So, Doktora, may tanong ko lang ho sa inyo. So, the 10 days is the barest minimum
Opo.
para it cannot go ano na yan ho. Ay, okay.
10 days po without testing. May isang scenario, if we want to test at 7 days. Yung first week kasi talaga po yung pinaka-highest possibility that you will develop symptoms. So test at 7 days and then wait for the result. If negative, then pwede nang ma-release. So mababawasan siguro from 10 to, depende on how fast the turnaround time of the result is, go down to 8 days, 9 days, no? But with testing, if we want testing, but it has to be at the 7th day. Yeah. That's the other scenario. Siguro, i-costing yon, no? How much is the cost of the test and the, kung mabawasan yung 10 days ng 9 days, 8 days, no? If you have a negative result. So, the quarantine period should not go below 7 days. So, maglalaro lang po sa 7 to 10 days kung maglalagay tayo ng testing para mabawasan yung 10.
Bob, Secretary Bello, do you have any question?
No more, Mr. President. I think Secretary Galvez and Secretary Anyo already joined me.
Well, it is clear that really the medical guys would really go for the strictest measure. As a matter of fact, they are not, from what I sense, is that they are not ready to move an inch backward. To them, the paramount interest, we were discussing here about the expense of government. And you would notice that they never mentioned about money, except that they are really insisting to the strictest measures to protect our borders nga. So let us, that would be a good discussion after this meeting.